Oh, well, this is exciting. Earlier today, we're being told tourists and National Trust rangers saw the legendary fin disappear into a magical doorway within the rock face here at the Giant's Causeway.
Tourists and park rangers at the Giant's Causeway in Ireland watched a solid slab of basalt swing open like a door and close again without leaving a single mark. No crack, no dust, no trace it had ever moved. Everyone laughed it off. Rock does not do that. So they called it a hoax and moved on. But one former archaeologist drove to that cliff alone, with no permit and no crew, pressed a drill into the rock beside that door, and sent a camera through the hole. What that camera found inside a sealed chamber that had been closed for longer than anyone can measure will change the way you see that cliff forever. The edge that was too clean. Kieran O'Hara was not the kind of man who chased strange stories. He was a former field archaeologist with years of subsurface surveys and structural analysis across Ireland behind him. He published nothing he could not defend. When others speculated, he went back to the evidence. He was precisely the kind of man who should have watched that footage and moved on. He did not move on. The footage had been circulating quietly for a while. Short clips, shaky, passed hand to hand between researchers and enthusiasts online. What it showed was a section of the cliff face at the Giant's Causeway swinging open like a door and then closing again. The people who claimed to have seen it in person were not random passersby. They were tourists and National Trust rangers, people who worked at that cliff regularly, people who knew what the rock was supposed to look like. Most people dismissed it within minutes. And honestly, that made sense. Basalt is one of the hardest rocks on Earth. It does not open. When it moves, it breaks. When it breaks, it leaves rubble, dust, and cracks. It does not slide open cleanly and close back up without a trace. So, people called it a hoax, shared it around for a few days, and moved on. But O'Hara did not watch the footage the way everyone else did. While everyone else watched the movement, he watched the edge, the exact line where the rock had separated from the cliff around it. Here is something you need to understand about basalt. When basalt moves for any reason at all, it always leaves evidence. The two surfaces that separate grind against each other, and that grinding produces crushed dust, tiny cracks that spread outward from the break line, and a visible seam where the two faces met. It does not matter how small the movement is. The physics do not allow a clean separation. There is always something left behind. The footage showed nothing. No dust, no cracks spreading from the edges, no grinding marks where the slab had pulled away from the cliff. The rock moved and settled back as though it had never shifted at all. O'Hara went through the footage frame by frame, hunting for the trick. A shadow mistaken for a moving edge, a disguise cut in the filming, a video compression error making a static image look like motion. He found none of it. The longer he looked, the worse it got. Because careful examination is supposed to expose the lie. Here it only kept confirming there was no lie to find. What made it worse was something O'Hara already knew and had never taken seriously. The Giant's Causeway had a folklore tradition that stretched back centuries before tourists ever set foot on those rocks. Local people, generation after generation, had described certain sections of that cliff face as shifting during specific tidal conditions, moving, breathing. Geologists had dismissed it as superstition. O'Hara had dismissed it as superstition. He had filed it away in the same place he filed every claim that had no data behind it. After going through that footage frame by frame, he pulled it back out. A man who had spent his entire career demanding evidence before he believed anything closed his laptop, got in his car, and drove alone to a coastline he had absolutely no business being at. Not because he had become a believer, because after everything he had just seen in those frames, he could no longer find a single solid reason not to go. The question was not whether something had moved. The question was how to get to whatever was behind it. The equipment and the entry point. The first thing to understand about what O'Hara did next is that it was illegal. The Giant's Causeway is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. That is not just a title. It means the rock face is protected under Northern Irish and UK heritage law. Any unauthorized interference with the formation is a prosecutable criminal offense. O'Hara knew this. He was a trained archaeologist. He had spent his career working within the boundaries of heritage protection legislation. He knew exactly what he was about to do, and he did it anyway. He did not bring a team. He did not file a permit. He told nobody where he was going. If something had gone wrong on that cliff face, nobody would have known where to look for him. He did not try to drill through the door itself. That would have been close to impossible. Basalt that thick resists direct drilling for hours, possibly days, and forcing through it risks collapsing everything around the entry point. So instead, he spent hours pressing his bare hands against the cliff face, moving slowly, feeling for changes in texture and surface temperature and the way the rock caught the light at different angles. What he was looking for was a weak point. Basalt does not form as one uniform block. When lava cools, it contracts, and that contraction creates layers of varying density and internal stress pockets distributed unevenly through the rock. None of that is visible from the surface. But a man trained to read grain orientation and fracture alignment can feel for it and infer where the stone is thinner or less resistant than the sections around it. The drill he used was a Hilti TE-70 rotary hammer. It is a professional-grade tool built for heavy masonry and reinforced stone. He fitted it with a 40mm carbide-tipped masonry bit extended through a series of couplings so it could reach real depth without requiring a wide entry hole. A narrow bore meant less surface disturbance and less risk of destabilizing the rock around him. Here is the detail that raises a question nobody has answered. The Hilti TE-70 operates at approximately 110 decibels when cutting through stone. The Giant's Causeway has regular ranger patrols. The risk of being heard and caught was not small. O'Hara drilled without being detected. That means he either got lucky with the timing, or he knew when that section of the cliff would be unwatched. A trained archaeologist with professional connections to heritage institutions working in that region would not have had difficulty finding out patrol schedules. He has never explained how he avoided detection. That silence sits uncomfortably. The entry point he chose was not on the door itself. It was beside it, close enough that if there was any kind of space running parallel to that section of cliff behind the door, his drill would punch straight into it. He was not trying to force the door open. He was knocking on the wall right next to it. He pressed the drill against the rock, and the rock pushed back the way it was supposed to, right up until the moment it stopped. What happened next happened faster than he could react. The moment the resistance vanished, O'Hara set the drill against the weak point, and the rock pushed back exactly the way it was supposed to. Dense, unyielding. The vibration coming through the tool was textbook solid basalt. The dust coming out of the borehole was normal. Everything behaved. Minutes passed and nothing changed. Then it did. And it gave him no warning at all. One moment, the bit was grinding through solid stone. The next moment, it was grinding through nothing. The resistance dropped instantly and completely. O'Hara had been bracing his whole body against the drill, and when that force vanished, the tool lurched forward several inches before he could stop it. The feedback changed from a dense, heavy grind to something hollow and empty. The way a knock sounds completely different on a solid wall versus one with nothing behind it. He cut the power and went completely still. Here is what that moment meant for a man with his training. When a drill punches through into a natural cavity in coastal basalt, it produces a specific acoustic signature. A constructed space, something shaped or worked by human hands, produces a different one. O'Hara would have known the difference the instant the drill crossed that boundary. He has never stated which one he heard. That is not an oversight. That is a choice. There is more. When a drill breaches a sealed underground cavity, the pressure difference between the inside and outside almost always produces a reaction, an inward rush of air or an outward expulsion. O'Hara experienced neither. Complete stillness. No air movement in either direction. That is not normal for a sealed natural cavity. Then there was the temperature. A sealed underground space sits at a different temperature than the rock and air around it. The moment O'Hara punched through, he should have felt something. Cold, warmth, anything. He reported nothing. No change at all. As though whatever was on the other side had been sitting in perfect equilibrium with the outside world for an extraordinarily long time. He crouched on that cliff face with an illegal borehole in front of him. and a certainty that had nothing to do with what he had seen yet. The rock had already told him everything through the drill in his hands. He had just opened something that was built to stay closed. The question was no longer whether there was something on the other side. The question was, what kind of something it was. The sealed air and the decision to widen. Before O'Hara did anything else, he listened. He leaned close to the opening and stayed completely still. No air moved through the hole, no echo came back from the other side, no sound of water dripping, rock settling, or anything shifting in the dark. Complete silence. Complete stillness. As though whatever was behind that wall had been holding its breath for a very long time. That silence was not a small detail. It was the most alarming thing O'Hara had encountered so far, and here is why. The Giant's Causeway sits directly on the North Atlantic coast. The sea has been working at that rock face for millions of years. Coastal basalt almost never stays perfectly sealed over time because water is relentless. It finds microscopic cracks. It forces its way into weak points. It widens gaps over centuries until air can move through them. A natural hollow sitting inside a coastal cliff will almost always have some connection to the outside world. Even a tiny one, even a hairline crack somewhere that lets a single breath of air pass through. This space had nothing. Not a whisper of airflow, not a trace of exchange between whatever was inside and the atmosphere outside. Something had kept it closed, completely and perfectly closed. There are only two explanations for that, and neither one is comfortable. Either whatever is inside that space was sealed in when the rock formed around it 60 million years ago, or it was placed inside deliberately, and then deliberately sealed by something that knew exactly what it was doing. There is no third option that fits the evidence. Here is what makes that second explanation deeply unsettling. Certain microorganisms can survive indefinitely in sealed underground spaces with no oxygen and no light. They go dormant and they wait. If that cavity had been sealed long enough for no air to move in or out, any organic material inside it could theoretically still be in a preserved state. O'Hara understood that before he widened the hole. He widened it anyway. There is also something a trained archaeologist working in Ireland would have known and could not have easily ignored. In early medieval Irish texts, sealed spaces inside rock described as having no wind and no echo are consistently associated with places the living were not supposed to enter, spaces that belonged to something else. The silence O'Hara was pressed against matched those descriptions almost exactly. He would have known what those texts said happened to the people who went in, regardless. He widened the opening carefully, just enough to feed a machine through, because whatever was on the other side, O'Hara had already decided he was not going in after it himself. He fed a small tracked crawler through the gap. It was a camera mounted on treads with its own lights at the front. He let the lens stabilize, and then he sent it forward into the dark, the same way you would lower something into deep water when you have no idea what is waiting at the bottom. What the crawler found in the first few meters was almost ordinary. Almost. The crawler descent, the interior. The first thing wrong was the floor. Not broken, not uneven the way rock naturally sits after millions of years of geological pressure shifting and settling beneath it. Flat. Completely and unnaturally flat. Smooth in a way that basalt does not become on its own. Someone or something had leveled that surface deliberately, and whatever had been used to do it had worked well enough that the result had held for a very long time. The crawler moved forward and the ceiling came into the light next. Embedded in the rock overhead were structures that had no business being there, not hanging from the ceiling, not growing out of it, built into it, running horizontally across the space at intervals that were too consistent to be accidental, each one positioned at a spacing that matched the one before it and the one after it, evenly, precisely. Here is why that should stop you completely. Volcanic rock forms according to physics. When lava cools and contracts, it cracks along predictable lines determined by temperature and pressure. Those cracks produce the famous columns at the Giant's Causeway. That geometry is real and it is remarkable, but it is the geometry of stress and cooling. It follows rules set by nature. It does not produce evenly spaced horizontal structures running in straight lines through curving stone. That kind of spacing requires measurement. It requires a plan. Whatever O'Hara's camera was showing him had been put there on purpose. Then the hanging forms appeared. They were suspended from somewhere above the crawler in a loose cluster, dark surfaced, absorbing the light from the camera rather than reflecting it back. And they would not stay completely still. A subtle and barely perceptible shift moved through them, even though no air was circulating in that sealed space. Nothing should have been moving them. There was no draft, no current, no vibration from outside, but they shifted, slightly, continuously, as though their position had never been fully fixed. Beneath them, the floor was stained dark and covered in shallow pools of liquid scattered across the stone. The liquid was almost black under direct light. When the camera angle shifted, faint variations surfaced in the color, tones that pulled slightly away from the basalt around them. This was not simply water sitting on rock. The crawler sat completely still, and the liquid rippled. That meant one of two things. Either the liquid itself was being moved from somewhere beneath the surface, or the ground underneath it was in slow, continuous motion, in a space that was supposed to be completely sealed and completely dead. What makes this deeply uncomfortable is that this configuration has a precedent. In Iron Age ritual spaces excavated across Ireland and Britain, archaeologists have found preserved organic material hung from ceiling structures above dark liquid-filled basins set into the floor. Votive offerings. Things placed there deliberately as part of something that was never meant to be understood by outsiders. The layout the crawler was moving through matched that pattern exactly. O'Hara would have recognized it. He said nothing about it in his account. That silence is its own kind of answer. The crawler pressed on beneath the hanging forms and kept moving. The further it went, the more the chamber made clear it did not want the machine going any deeper. The flare with no source. The air thickened first. Moisture began building up inside the chamber, not heavy enough to fall as drops, but dense enough to blur the camera's ability to judge distance. Edges softened. The light from the crawler's lamp scattered outward instead of cutting forward cleanly. The floor darkened in patches, and the crawler's tracks began pressing faint impressions into a layer of something that was not solid rock and not quite liquid either. The signal connecting O'Hara's controller to the crawler started breaking up. Static moved across the feed. The image distorted, steadied, then distorted again. Then the floor showed him something that had nothing to do with moisture or geology. The crawler's lights caught two things lying on the ground ahead that O'Hara's entire professional training had no category for. The first was a shape, elongated, partially submerged in the dark pooling liquid that had been gathering in the low points of the floor. It did not match the rock around it in texture or in form. It did not belong to the geology of that space. O'Hara stopped the crawler and held the camera on it without moving. The second thing was nearby, small, cylindrical, corroded but sitting upright on the floor of a sealed volcanic chamber. Sitting the way an object sits when a person set it down and never came back to collect it. O'Hara never used the word bones. He never used the word lamp. But he was a man who had spent his entire career using precise language. A man who hedged carefully on every distance and every measurement and every shape he described in that chamber. He did not hedge on these two things. He described them once, and then he moved the crawler forward without offering any explanation for what they were. A man that precise does not leave something unclassified by accident. He leaves it unclassified because naming it would mean accepting what it meant. That is when the flare happened. From somewhere ahead, past the edge of what the camera could see, a sudden burst of light bloomed through the moisture in the air and washed across the lens. It was brighter than the crawler's own lamps. And then it was gone. No source, no glow left behind. Nothing to explain where it had come from. O'Hara stopped the crawler and held position. He scrubbed the footage back and isolated the frames. The flare showed up across multiple frames in sequence. It was not a camera malfunction. It was not a reflection bouncing off the crawler itself. Something inside that sealed chamber, a space that had been closed off from the world for longer than anyone could measure, was producing its own light. There is a scientific explanation worth naming here, not because it makes things better, but because it makes things worse. Compressed crystalline rock under seismic stress can produce sudden bursts of light through a process called piezoelectric discharge. It is a documented and real phenomenon. But what it means in this context is that the rock surrounding that chamber was under active pressure. The structure O'Hara was sitting beside, alone, with no safety equipment and no second exit, was not stable. O'Hara drove the crawler forward anyway, toward the spot where the light had been, toward whatever had made it. The ground deteriorated further. At approximately 20 meters in the tracks, lost all grip, and the crawler stopped moving forward entirely. The signal was close to failing completely. Here is the detail that reframes everything. The basalt column formation at the Giant's Causeway extends approximately 15 to 25 meters back from the cliff face, depending on the section. At 20 meters in, the crawler was no longer behind the cliff face that tourists stand in front of and photograph. It was underneath the columns themselves. O'Hara started bringing the crawler back. He told himself later that the decision was purely practical. The machine was stuck. The signal was failing. All of that was true. But he also admitted he was never entirely clear on whether the crawler stopped because it physically could not go forward, or because he had stopped wanting it to. A man that precise about language does not leave that distinction unresolved unless the answer is one he did not want to give. He brought the crawler out, and then he did something that told you everything about what he had seen in there. The ceiling. O'Hara did not send the crawler back in. He pulled his equipment and sealed the opening carefully and completely. From the outside, when he was done, the cliff face showed no sign that anything had been done to it at all. No fracture lines, no debris, no trace of a drill entry. The rock looked exactly as it had the day he arrived. Think about what that means coming from this specific man. O'Hara was a trained archaeologist whose entire professional life was built around the obligation to document, report, and preserve. Under the Historic Environment Amendment Act of 2011, an archaeologist who discovers evidence of a significant find at a scheduled monument in Northern Ireland is legally required to report it. Failing to do so is a criminal offense. O'Hara sealed the hole, left no trace, and filed nothing. He did not protect the site. He protected whatever was inside it. The stone door has not been recorded moving again since. But the Giant's Causeway receives close to 1 million visitors every year, and almost none of them are watching the rock face for mechanical movement. The door could have moved a dozen times since O'Hara's visit, and the record would show nothing. There is also a question nobody has ever answered. Where did the original footage of the door moving come from? Who filmed it? Why has no journalist, no heritage body, and no geological institution ever attempted to locate or formally analyze it? The entire story rests on that footage, and its origin has never been established. That gap is not separate from the story. It is part of it. Now, hold everything together. A basalt door that moved without leaving a mark. A sealed cavity with no pressure change and no airflow on breach. A leveled floor, hanging forms above dark pooling liquid, ceiling beams built into volcanic rock with spacing that geology cannot produce. 2 objects on that floor that a precise man described once and never named. A light source with no origin. A crawler that stopped directly underneath the columns themselves. O'Hara hedged on everything he described from inside that chamber. Distances, shapes, colors, everything except one thing. He never once called any of it natural. Someone built something inside that cliff and sealed it well enough that it stayed hidden for longer than we have records to measure. One man found it, looked at what was inside, and sealed it back up without a word. The chamber is still there, and whatever is on that floor is still exactly where the crawler left it.